King County, Washington, February 1984. A near 2-year police pursuit of the Green River Killer fails to reach a breakthrough. It's the largest unsolved serial murder case in the U.S., with at least 16 young women dead. Investigators no longer consider Melvin Foster their prime suspect, and they're essentially back to square one.
We weren't able to find anything that connected him to any of the victims. We surveilled him for a long time. Weren't able to catch him doing anything.
The investigation is at a dead end. A vicious predator remains at large, and he's outsmarting the police at every turn.
So you duped the prostitutes so you could kill them. Who else did you dupe?
In some ways I duped the police.
A new wave of fear grips the SeaTac Strip. One prostitute tells police about a John, whom she describes as weird and different. She says she got a look at his ID. His name, Gary Ridgway. Detectives dig into Ridgway's background and discover he has a record.
He had been arrested in 1982 in a decoy operation that the Sheriff's Department was operating on Pacific Highway for frequenting a prostitute. He freely admitted it.
Ridgway doesn't appear to fit the FBI's profile of the Green River Killer. He has been married twice, has a son, and has worked at the same job for 13 years. Still, police call him in for questioning. Ridgway agrees to take a polygraph test. Detectives ask him if he murdered any of the Green River victims, and he answers no. Ridgway passes the polygraph, and police let him go.
He was like several of the suspects. The files were just pended because there was nothing else that could be done on them.
June 1985. More than a year passes, and police find new burial sites with 15 more victims, raising the total dead to 31. They comb the surrounding areas exhaustively for clues.
They would do these outdoor crime scenes like archaeological sites, rooting through sand and dirt, looking for little fibers, looking in birds' nests in trees. It was beyond no stone left unturned.
It's at this point that the task force makes a critical leap in technology. To deal with a massive backlog of evidence, they install a sophisticated new computer system to cross-reference names and keywords. In September 1986, a search reveals new information about a familiar character, Gary Ridgway. Investigators uncover a report by police in Des Moines, Washington, 16 miles south of Seattle. The report, filed in 1983, identifies Ridgway as a suspect in the disappearance of an 18-year-old prostitute named Marie Malvar. Malvar was last seen climbing into a pickup truck on the SeaTac Strip in April 1983. Malvar's pimp went looking for her after she failed to return. He found the truck parked outside this house, just a few blocks off the strip. The truck's owner, Gary Ridgway. Several days later, Des Moines police officers visited Ridgway at his home. He denied picking Malvar up, and they left him alone after that. How did the information about Malvar and Ridgway get overlooked? The Des Moines police did not share the report with the Green River Task Force for several months. And then it slipped through the cracks.
We can kind of look back on things with hindsight, because the one thing they were trying not to do was to overlook things like this.
In 1986, task force detectives begin an extensive background check on Gary Ridgway. They make a critical discovery. The dates on which 27 victims disappeared coincide with days that Ridgway took off from his work at a local truck plant. Investigators begin tailing Ridgway. They watch him cruise the strip, leering at prostitutes.
I used to follow him, drive slowly up the highway, looking around. He liked being out there, every opportunity that he got.
April 8, 1987. Detectives obtain a warrant to search Ridgway and his property. They take samples of his hair and saliva, while another team turns over his home.
They absolutely dissected that house and collected every piece of evidence that they could. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, there was not one single thing that could be physically connected back to one of these crime scenes. So there was a great deal of frustration.
Police put a mouth swab containing his saliva into cold storage. They know that forensic technology is making advances that could one day solve the case. What do investigators expect to learn from the mouth swab? Whether Ridgway's DNA matches the Green River killers. Semen samples removed from 3 of the Green River victims are already in cold storage, but DNA analysis is still in its early stages.
Everybody was well aware that DNA technology was on the horizon, and it just wasn't there. And so the evidence was archived appropriately, awaiting for that technology to evolve.
Detectives have no choice but to wait for science to catch up, or for Ridgway to slip up. They make no arrest, and the case goes cold. In fact, the killer got spooked.
Said your emotions were different. How so?
It stopped cold turkey after that, because it's gotta stop.
The following decade passes quietly. The Green River Task Force is reduced to a single detective, Tom Jensen, and there are no breaks in the case. King County voters elect David Reichert their sheriff. Throughout the 1990s, he and Jensen keep tabs on advances in DNA testing.
We started to talk about, what do you think we can do now, years later, where can we go? And everyone agreed that really the thing we need to focus on was DNA.
By 2001, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab acquires the technology necessary for DNA testing. The new equipment allows scientists to construct DNA profiles out of degraded evidence.
We've had all the cases sitting in the past, cold cases. We now had a technology where we can take those cases, reassess what was left.
March 2001. Detective Jensen submits Green River case evidence to forensic scientist Beverly Himmick for analysis. She uses semen samples extracted from victims Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Ann Christensen. The killer's handiwork, lodging stones inside 2 of these victims, actually helped to preserve his sperm samples.
It did preserve enough sperm that we were able to generate a DNA profile.
Himmick determines that the same man raped all 3 victims. She then compares his DNA profile against the saliva sample taken from Gary Ridgway. It's a perfect match.
At that point, it was time to notify Detective Jensen and tell him that we had some good results.
Jensen later delivers the results to Sheriff Reichert in person.
I had an envelope in my pocket, and I took out the envelope and I gave it to him.
I grabbed the end of it, and I said, you know what, Tom, I don't even need to open it. It's Gary Ridgway.
Through science, authorities finally identify the serial murder that eluded them for 19 years.
You know what? We laid the groundwork. We did the work where the rubber meets the road, where detectives go out, and we were thorough. And then the science comes together years later, and out of 40,000 tip sheets, 1 person is identified. I mean, that just gives me chills today, still thinking about it.
November 30th, 2001. Police capture Gary Ridgway as he leaves work, photographing the arrest as it happens.
I told him that he was under arrest for the murder of several women in King County. He looked at me, I took his lunch bucket out of his hand, and he said simply, okay.
Authorities charge Ridgway with 4 counts of first-degree murder.
We told him what kind of evidence we had against him. I didn't see fear in his eyes. I didn't see anxiety in his eyes. Gary asked one question on the way back to the offices, and that was what was going to happen to his truck.
We do not know if Ridgway is responsible for the deaths of any more women.
Privately, Reichert has no doubt. He watches police escort Ridgway to the King County Jail for booking.
I just looked at him and stared at him, and I said, we got you, a**hole.
If he's convicted, Ridgway could face the death penalty. But authorities know that he may hold the key to dozens of unsolved murders and missing persons cases. Many victims' families have waited nearly 2 decades for answers.
Justice involves more than simply retribution against the defendant. There's also the surviving victims to consider.
Prosecutors weigh a controversial deal with a killer. When the final report continues. Seattle, Washington, April 15th, 2002. After hunting for the Green River Killer for nearly 2 decades, police have made an arrest. They hold this man, 53-year-old Gary Ridgway, in custody. Prosecutors vow to seek the death penalty against him, their case backed by solid DNA evidence. Ridgway's lawyers argue that his life should be spared if he provides a thorough account of the Green River murders.
I told Gary, if you have information, let's bring it out and see if the prosecutor will talk to us.
Ridgway considers his options and makes a decision that will open a door into the darkest recesses of the serial killer's mind. He admits that he is the Green River Killer, and within weeks will confess to murdering more than 60 women.
He said, you know, I killed them all. It was a moment, you know, I could never forget. You kind of feel the chill up your spine.
The defense reaches out to prosecutors to strike a plea bargain, but the state is reluctant to entertain the offer.
The obvious objection could be characterized as making a deal with the devil, sparing a man from the death penalty when that man, if anyone, deserved it completely.
So why do prosecutors finally agree to a plea bargain? Detectives want information that will help them close unsolved murder cases.
We felt it was best to take the offer. It was a matter of holding him responsible for all these cases, at the same time allowing the families to get some answers to questions they had. You know, was my daughter killed by this guy?
Morning, Gary.
Morning.
Morning.
June 13th, 2003. Authorities transfer Gary Ridgway to a secret location where detectives will question him at length on video camera. The FBI sends in veteran psychological profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole to interview Ridgway as well. Her job is to help the FBI build better profiles of serial killers so that law enforcement can identify similar offenders in the future.
We're teaching other people with your help about serial killers.
What is O'Toole's strategy for getting Ridgway to talk? She appeals to his ego and lets him take the lead.
I may have been one of the first people in his lifetime that sat down and said, let's learn more about you and what you're all about.
As you have your hands around someone's throat, tell me what that process was like for you.
That was some way I could get back at a woman.
So you want to play to the narcissism, you want to play to the arrogance.
She's looking at me and trying to get me to stop. Please don't. But I still kept on choking her. I couldn't let her go. She turned me in and I wouldn't be able to kill anymore.
While O'Toole tries to learn what makes Ridgway tick, detectives must corroborate each of the murders he confesses to. They listen for information that only the killer would know. Ridgway is forthcoming when he is able to connect with what he likes to call the old Gary, his former murderous self.
What's the old Gary gonna tell us about these scenes?
But
the new Gary wouldn't.
I can't explain it. I don't know what's going on in my mind. Just that I'm bringing out this rage and I need to get it out.
It emerges that a deep, simmering anger drove Ridgway to kill. But what was the source of it? Investigators don't know yet. Because Ridgway murdered so many women, he has a hard time remembering their names or faces.
Some people go home if they've committed a murder and they would be bouncing off the walls. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? That was not you, was it?
That was, by the time I got home, I was relaxed. I probably had a beer.
The interviews stretch from days into weeks. Ridgway reveals that it was he who wrote a letter to a Seattle newspaper in 1984. The same letter that an FBI profiler had dismissed as a hoax.
The police on the task force had relied upon the FBI profiler for accuracy, and so they were angry at the FBI over this. They were really steamed.
There it is. Isn't that a teeth?
From June to October 2003, Ridgway accompanies police to more than 20 sites where he says he dumped his victims' remains.
The hardest part of the field trips was the fact that he enjoyed them so much. He would be in a jubilant mood every time we put him in the van.
Authorities dig up 4 more sets of remains, the first Green River victims unearthed in nearly 5 years. By November, police finish corroborating 48 of the murders that Ridgway has confessed to. But he's never given them a consistent answer about the total number of women he killed.
We charged him with 48, which is a conservative number. It's almost certainly less than the number of people he killed.
For the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield.
Guilty.
November 5th, 2003. Gary Ridgway pleads guilty to 48 counts of first-degree murder.
For the death of Colleen R. Brockman.
Guilty.
Ridgway's plea deal that saves him from the death penalty is made public. Some of the victims' families are outraged.
If you let a guy, plea down and get life, who's just confessed to killing 50 and you suspect maybe even more, where's the fairness in sentencing anybody else to death who may have killed one person?
But most families are relieved to learn what happened to their loved ones after as many as 20 years.
The point was to try to help somebody else have their person be found, because I can't imagine never knowing what happened to Opal. I can't imagine that.
Other questions still linger. How did Ridgway murder so many women for so long and get away with it? And why did he do it? The answers when the final report continues. November 2003. After pleading guilty to 48 counts of murder, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, agrees to another month of interviews with authorities in Seattle. They want to know how a truck painter with a below-average IQ of around 85 eluded them for almost 2 decades.
It's almost as if someone decided to manufacture or design the perfect serial killer.
You went to a lot of work to create these bruises.
How did Ridgway manipulate so many women? He pretended to be a meek and harmless family man.
Ridgway used a lot of techniques to put the girls at ease so they were more relaxed and trusted him.
He reveals that he sometimes took his grade school-age son with him when he picked up hookers. If he was alone, then Ridgway showed off photos of the boy.
I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. And they would see my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person.
He would use that normalness to convince them, hey, there's nothing wrong with me. Come on, I've got toys on the seat of my car. I'm a father.
Ridgway conned even the most street-smart prostitutes with his small stature and unimpressive appearance.
Here's a guy who's not really muscle-bound, just an ordinary John, and yet that was their downfall. My appearance was different from what I really was.
Ridgway's talent for leading a seemingly normal life allowed him to fly under the radar for years. He defied the predictions of even the best FBI profilers. Why were profilers so wrong in this case? Because Ridgway deviated from the norms of many serial killers. He did not fit the pattern of a loner who cannot function in society. Instead, Ridgway held down a job for 30 years, got married 3 times, and had a son. And unlike the profile, Ridgway had no criminal history of sexual assault or rape, and he was not an outdoorsman. Profiling was still in its infancy when the Green River killings began, and profilers still had much to learn.
The type of profile that was done back in the 1980s would have been so broad, its applicability to one specific individual would have not been there.
But the FBI profile did accurately predict that the killer felt humiliated by his relationships with women. So he sought to punish and degrade his victims. Here, finally, Ridgway gets to the core of his impulse to kill, feelings of rage toward women.
Why'd you hate him so much?
Why did I hate him? Because women had control over me, and I don't like being controlled. And that's what it all comes down to, is control of those bitches. Nobody loved me, so them all.
What is the source of Ridgway's hatred toward women? He blames, in part, his relationship with his mother. According to Ridgway, his mother belittled him for wetting his bed until he was 13. She insisted on bathing him for all those years. After suffering this humiliation, he says he began to fantasize about murdering his mother. He reveals what he thought about doing on at least one occasion.
Walk me through what you were going to do with the knife in your head to your mother.
Cut her throat so she wouldn't stop degrading me.
By the same token, Ridgway says he felt sexually attracted to his mother.
Just a fantasy of wanting to have sex, to touch her, feel her body.
He confesses that he found that choking women sexually aroused him.
Sex and violence become intertwined. Once that happens, you cannot pull those elements apart.
What is the problem?
It just comes down to that I just love killing women.
December 16th, 2003. Authorities conclude their 5 months of interviews with the Green River Killer. FBI psychological profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole finds that, like many serial murderers, Gary Ridgway is typical in his ability to lead a double life.
The longer a serial killer is successful, the more normal their life will be from the outside, looking in. And that certainly was the case with Gary.
On December 18th, a judge sentences Ridgway to 48 consecutive life prison terms. Authorities transfer him to Washington State Penitentiary, where he is currently serving out his sentence. Though Ridgway will forever remain behind bars, many of the men and women who spent nearly 2 decades pursuing the killer find it impossible to let go.
We took so much pressure over this case, living with it day after day, wondering and hoping that somebody else doesn't get killed. And then, of course, after you catch him, if you'd have got him earlier, you could have saved somebody's life. Well, yeah, I think about that.
In the final report on the Green River Killer, it remains a mystery whether Gary Ridgway committed more murders than the 48 he confessed to. Police lost valuable time during the first year of the investigation, pursuing the wrong man, Melvin Foster. Investigators also faced challenges based on who the murder victims were. The anonymity that many prostitutes live by hampered the investigation's progress.
It was extremely difficult at many times to identify the remains. It was very difficult to find anyone who knew even when the victim had disappeared.
Another factor that threw police off Ridgway's trail, his polygraph results. How he passed the test in 1984 remains a matter of speculation.
The polygraph is built to deal with, 99% of society. There are people in the world that are just wired differently. It is not a tool that is effective on everyone.
The insights gleaned from Ridgway's interviews will no doubt give criminal profilers an edge when tracking similar killers in the future. It took the new science of DNA matching to finally solve the Green River case. The tragic saga also highlighted the limitations of criminal profiling, which in the end is more of an art than a science. An art that investigators continue to perfect.
In the 1970s and 80s Australia, if a dirty job needed to be done, one